Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Fireside Chat with Rich and Matt, Sapiens Part 2, presented by NatHab Expedition leaders Matt Meyer and Richard de Gouveia. It is a pleasure to have you both with us today. Matt, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Hi, Kendall. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for having us tonight, and thanks for joining us tonight. Quickly off the bat, I need to admit something, and you'll understand the reason why my co-pilot is smiling tonight. Last week, we were asked a question on why some of our ancestors were covered in hair and we were then balding, and I fully thought that the question was asked as to why we were balding on top of our head, and that's why I passed it over to Richard to answer that question, because he has a lot more experience in that field. But I read about 20 articles and I couldn't figure it out, and I didn't know the reason why we were balding. And so I sent Richard a message and said, look, I can't figure it out. Have you got any ideas as to why we're balding? And he straightened me out and laughed for about 3 days about it. So I just had to admit that.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm really excited to be here with my balding head and Matt to discuss the second part of our awesome series on Sapiens. So Matt and I have a common thread that we both read an incredible book called Sapiens by Yuval Harari. A great read for anyone, and we've been delving into it and looking at how our evolution, our change has impacted the planet and impacted us. So this is a picture of me over here when I was back in my party days, when I was an Aztec, and Matt is a Spartan, hey?
I believe so, yes, because it was just recently made aware to me that some of the ancient Roman gladiators were in fact predominantly plant-based. So I thought, what better a role model for a modern day plant eater than a not beefed up, grassed up Spartan. So
exactly.
Today we're going to be moving further a little bit along from our last discussion on the early stages of man, more into the domestication and the agricultural revolution. And so I'm going to start with a short passage from the book Sapiens. So hunter-gatherers spent their time in more stimulating and varied ways and were less in danger of starvation and disease. The agricultural revolution certainly enlarged the sum total of food at the disposal of humankind, but the extra food did not translate into a better diet or more leisure. Rather, it translates into a population explosions and pampered elites. The average farmer worked harder than the average forager and got a worse diet in return. The agricultural revolution was history's biggest fraud. Who was responsible? Neither kings nor priests nor merchants. The culprits were a handful of plant species, including wheat, rice, and potatoes. These plants domesticated Homo sapiens rather than vice versa. So that was from Sapiens, the book, and it allows us to then dive into the domestication of plants and animals and how that allowed us to start building on from what was formerly little tribes and little communities into much bigger sort of human ecosystems, kingdoms, cities, and etc.
So everything started, basically, evolution is driven by climate and what's happening around us. We're then pushed in different ways. And right at the end of the Ice Age, there was so much water being sucked up by the ice sheets in the north and the south that it started changing weather patterns. And around the Fertile Crescent, which is the green area here that you can see, this area started going from a very fertile, lush place into droughts that lasted for centuries. And these droughts then had a major impact on things. So the Nefusian people then went on and they had two strategies. One, become more effective at hunting. So they made up these awesome arrow tips, which were far more effective to them, called a harrow point. And what we found for the first time was a sickle. This is one of the first sickles that they found around this region. And a sickle would only be made for the idea of making crops and harvesting crops easier, being able to gather things. And the whole reason why they were pushed this way is, as a drought goes, you don't want to go and have to hunt and gather and move, because you've got big distances to get to next water source, and you don't know if that water source is going to be there. So what do? You stick around a solid water source and you start growing food. So water then defined where the first civilizations could be, i.e. rivers. And in this Fertile Crescent, they also grew cereals, wheat, barley, and lentils and chickpeas, peas, flax. And domestication, basically, in a nutshell, is where we select desirable traits by breeding successive generations of plants or animals to get what we want out of it. So I'm sure Matt's going to touch on it now, but wild wheat, for example, would fall on the ground. It would be so brittle, it'll break up into pieces. So early humans bred for wheat that stayed on the stem longer so that they could harvest it better.
And if before we go into the wheat, if we can just have a look at that map quickly, Rich, just to show us exactly where in the world a lot of the modern day crops come from. And it's interesting in that you can see a lot of these areas all sort of predominantly fall on either side of the equatorial region, but not many of the crops were domesticated from sort of the Amazonian region, the Central African rainforest, or Southeast Asia. And that could have been for a variety of reasons, but the one that personally I think, or the one that we've chatted about, Richard and I, is that there was obviously much less competition between sort of food sources for people, so they could move around and being hunter-gatherers. There was no need for them to cultivate a single crop and stick with it, because there was so much abundance of all of these food sources. But going from those regions, we focused then on wheat. Now, wheat was domesticated about 12 to 10,000 years ago, in a very similar region to that crescent that Richard was just talking about. The ancient wheat varietals would have had a much larger awn, much larger root system, a sort of almost a leafier appearance, very much like, I mean, it is a grass essentially. And so all of those traits of that plant make it very difficult to cultivate. You can't grow them right next to each other. You can see the ancient wheat grain there in the bottom, in amongst those rocks, and you can't get a plow through that. You can't sow the field easily. You can't harvest it easily. So all of those traits, we removed the rocks out of their ways, we put them in furrows, and then, as Richard was describing, through selective breeding over the years and over the decades and centuries and millennia that have followed, we've been able to reduce all of their protection against their environmental threats, bugs and fungi and all of that kind of thing, by spraying pesticides and removing those competing factors from their environment to give us this grain that we know now. That wild Emma definitely still, it's now become a very popular food source for health fanatics as an ancient grain. And wheat has just been overbred and overbred and overbred to the point where the level of food allergies to wheat is just growing exponentially. And that's because of that over modification of these crops. and the fact that they're not harvested in the way that they were. They're cut, they're ground up, they're bleached. You're basically getting the calories. You're not getting many of the nutrients out of them. To the point where right now, as we sit worldwide, globally, the average is that 1/5, so 20% of every human in the world, this is across the globe, every human in the world's average daily dietary intake is made up of this one grain, this one specific plant in wheat.
Crazy, crazy, crazy. So beyond plants, animals were also a big part of it. So cattle is now one of the most successful large mammal besides us on the planet. There are 1.5 billion cattle living on the planet at the moment. And what's fascinating is in the last few years, they've come up with the idea that all of these were bred from a small base or descendant of a small base of about 80 individuals. So they were domesticated from a wild ox called an auroch. And this was in the Near East about 10,500 years ago. And they were much bigger than our current cattle. And they were domesticated probably independently about twice. And they were done because they were multifunctional. They had many different uses. So we could get milk from them, blood from them, fat from them, meat from them, clothing, and we can also get tools manufactured from their hair, their bone, their horns, their hide, their hooves. And dung was also fuel. Fire was a big part of the change of us, the ability for us to cook food, the ability for us to clear areas and bring our prey closer to us, to slash and burn to make space for crops. So they were a significant part of our lives that even in cave paintings, they became a big part of it. The other part and other place that they were believed to be domesticated was in India, in the Indus Valley, around 7,500 years ago. And if you look at the Hindu religion, they worship cows. They find them sacred. Now, they're obviously part of the religious part is huge. But another crazy theory that I've heard, and take it or leave it, is that magic mushrooms grow within their dung. So there could have been a spiritual aspect to the use of these hallucinogens along the way. And like I say, they were depicted within our cave art. They made it easier for us to plow things, to get through stuff. But first we had to domesticate them. So what did we have to do? You take a crazy big animal that is the largest of all the herbivores in Europe. Now you have to try and define it. So you start breeding it so that it becomes smaller, so that it is less crazy and less likely to try and kill you or run away. And so you build through these things and it becomes part of our being. Nowadays, we eat cows like it's going out of fashion. It not only takes up a lot of space to have the cows, but we also now are trying to make it easier to feed them. So we have separate crops which we grow just to feed the cows. So you're losing all the space where as a hunter-gatherer, you weren't losing that space. The animal knew what to eat, you ate what you needed to eat, and on occasion you would eat some meat. And it became a bigger part of our diet, bigger part of our agriculture, being able to till fields, to move rocks, to open areas up and do things. So you can see in here, we can see that the first animal that was domesticated was actually a dog. And so we moved on. So our pigs came from wild boars, our goats came from Persian ibex, and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of different ways that we domesticated things. So let's have a look at some of the spuds and their impact on our lives and domestication.
You could almost say that we're moving on from the cattle there.
You lay in bed thinking about that last night.
I had to. So the humble potato, you've got this little tuber that grows under the ground, and a lot of people don't actually. I mean, it was an interesting thing to me as to where these came from. most people know them as French fries or potato chips or all of that, but they're actually, I mean, they've got a beautiful array of colors where they originated from, but they've been bred to the size so that they can supply the carbohydrates needed to sustain the numbers that they have essentially been modified to do so. Modern world, the potato only reared its head about sort of 400 or 500 years ago, around the mid 16th century. And before then, I mean, they were domesticated in Peru and Chile, but they were domesticated 10 or 12,000 years ago, just after wheat was. But they only started to show themselves in our modern diet around the time when colonization was taking place. So when a lot of the European colonies started shifting and moving and going around the earth, so then with the spice trade and the food trade, and so came the humble potato to now be on our plate for, I mean, most of our diets, or a lot of our diets these days are made up by potatoes. And then you add it on to the next step, where now we've figured out a way how to freeze them. They're an even more global crop, so they can be farmed almost anywhere around the world. They are farmed in North America, South America, across Africa, across Asia, and then they're moved around the world as they're needed. Most of the crops in Africa stay in Africa, and a lot of the crops in North America stay in North America, but most of your crops from South America and Asia are then cut up and freeze-dried and sent around the rest of the world. But multiple species of these bulbous tubers are, it's not just the potato, it's not just a single plant species, but they have taken their DNA back, and they've actually got a fairly complex DNA for how simple they are. And they've dated it back to about 3 or 4 individual plants or plant species in that sort of Andean mountain range. And yeah, just from very humble beginnings in the mountains to now being seen across the world and on most people's plates almost every day.
Absolutely. I think it's fascinating to me when we look at something like this potato and how it was spread around. What we regard as national dishes now are not so much national dishes. I'm going to pull up this map again, because something like in Italy, tomato pasta is a big thing, but tomatoes only came from Mexico, so they were brought in. Indian food, which is seen to be hot and spicy, and chilies, peppers being in them, also from Mexico. So our food sources, as we've gone on, have changed and moved, and we've adopted certain things that were never in our region beforehand.
And I mean, something that Richard and I are exposed to a fair amount in our annual sort of safaris when we go to Madagascar is the vanilla plants, and that's only it has to be hand pollinated. The entire process has to be done manually because the animal that pollinates it is not found in the area that it's growing, and it's grown in Madagascar. 80 or 90% of the world's vanilla comes from Madagascar, but it originally comes from Mexico. And so the animal that is needed to pollinate it isn't there. And so that's another, a lot of these now, I mean, quinoa is now becoming a big thing worldwide, and that is an ancient grain from South America, and but everyone needs it around the world, to the point now where a lot of the people where it originally came from in South America no longer have access to it.
Yeah. So let's move on to another family favorite, our chicken. Again, now the most successful bird on the planet, all through domestication. And the question I was asked by a friend of mine was, who domesticated who? Cows are the most successful mammal, and chickens the most successful fowl. So bear that in mind. So there are 23.7 billion chickens at any one stage on the planet, with 50 billion bred every year. And it's still a bit of a puzzle as to how they came about and where the domestication actually happened, but it may have been domesticated originally for cockfights, and it was domesticated from a still extant bird called a red junglefowl, and it was then hybridized with a gray junglefowl. Now, the red junglefowl is still alive in Southeast Asia and still roams around there. So this probably happened about 8,000 years ago, and there may have been multiple places where it happened: South and Southeast Asia, South China, Thailand, Burma, India, so effectively through that Asiatic area, Southeast Asia area. Now, many studies have been able to compare the chickens to their ancestors because these fowls still live amongst us. Sorry, I'm jumping through there. And what they found is that the chickens are less active, have fewer social interactions. They're less aggressive to would-be predators. So, you know, towards us, one side of things, but they're easier prey to other things too. They're less susceptible to stress, which is a good thing for us growing them, and less likely to go looking for foreign food sources. So we can have them around in our gardens and they're not going to run away. If they know you're going to feed them, they'll stick around. Domestic chickens also have an increased adult body size. They have simplified plumage, and their egg production starts earlier. Now, one of the fascinating things about this red junglefowl is they took advantage of vast quantities of seed produced at the end of a multi-decade bamboo cycle. So bamboo will grow their different species. So let's call one species a 10-year species. It'll grow for 10 years. And at 10 years, it will release a massive amount of seeds and die. All of it will die and it'll restart again. And what this did was they would boost their reproduction at this stage because of this higher seed load. So really cool way of doing things. So what did we do? We took advantage of this. And in nature, you can see that these fowl will do 8 to 12 eggs. In the 1900s, a chicken was creating 120 eggs a year. Today, we've got it up to 300 just by feeding these things excess amounts of food. You can even see here just how much an average chicken weighed, just under a kilo, so 2.2 pounds, about 2 pounds, and now is over 8 pounds, 8.5 pounds, 9 pounds to this day. That's the way we've bred them. That's what domestication does.
So it essentially makes things sedentary and then to allow them to explode. Just like it did with us, essentially. I mean, the average human size has increased quite significantly over the last century or so. But that would probably come from a little bit more of the industrialization rather than the just breeding for the sake of those genes. So one of our first kingdoms that we're going to briefly touch on tonight would have been at essentially the epicenter of where a lot of these crops that we're talking about was certainly the wheat that we're talking about that proliferates the earth would have started in that similar region were the Egyptians. And so with the Egyptians, they had this incredible ability to do things beyond their age, or what their age should have allowed them to do in terms of how civilized they were sort of 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. They cultivated the land on the banks of the Nile. They created these intricate furrow networks that allowed, when the Nile River came in flood, it irrigated vast extenses and tracts of land to allow them to cultivate wheat, among other things, and this allowed this kingdom to grow. And around, as far as our modern history goes back to around about 2,800 to 3,000 BC, so about 5,000 years ago, was when the first of the pharaohs that we are familiar with And when they started the architecture of the pyramids and all of their very elaborate tombs and buildings would have started to come about. And that was around the time as well when they had this incredible cultivation going on. Now, one of wheat's ancestors, which is now becoming more popular, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, was the wheat that they cultivated there. And when they were in the trade routes with a lot of Europe, etc., with the Romans, a few thousand years later, their grain was different to the Romans' grain. And that was due to, in part, because of the breeding that had gone on. So their grain was a lot better and more suitable for slightly drier environments, because obviously on the Nile, yes, they do get that flood every year, but every 10 or 15 years there's a drought. And so these crops needed to be a little bit more hardier than the ones that were in Europe. But the Egyptians had the structure, this hierarchy of sort of society, where they had the pharaohs at the very top who were godlike. They were, in essence, walking, living gods. They, as a society, they had over 1,000 different gods, and they believed in a better afterlife. So they worshipped the gods. The gods were responsible for their daily lives and their well-beings. If there was a drought, it was because they'd done something to upset the gods. If there was a flood, likewise. If there were years of prosperity, they were then, it was because they had sacrificed. All the while, it could have just been environmental factors that were fluctuating. Because, I mean, the Egyptian empire spans over 1,000 odd years. And a lot of these eras are documented and shown in their hieroglyphics, in their etchings and the writings of their stories of the gods, and how this god favored that pharaoh and not this one. And just in terms of a kingdom, they were one of the very first to notably have domestication, to have a rising and falling of pharaohs, of kings, and one of the first that we can focus on to show just how modernization creates societies and makes us sedentary as a species.
So again, I think what Matt's really touching on here is agriculture gave us the ability, as populations grew, to create civilizations, to have large amounts of people in one area, and then agriculture became the root of all of it. The reason being is you have to feed people. And the next group that we're going to talk about are the Khmers. And they're located around, their empire was around Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Burma, all of those areas there are all taken within that area. And Angkor was an incredible city that was around in the 9th century. And this incredible place was built for the Hindu gods. It was first drawn, the people were first drawn to the area because there's a massive lake called Tonle Sap. And this lake, during the monsoons, and the monsoon is a 3-month period where there is extreme rainfall all the way from India through Southeast Asia. And when I say extreme amounts of rain, the amount of rain can get up to, in certain areas, like almost 30 feet of rain in a year. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount of rain. And what these guys did was they mastered this. This Tonle Sap lake actually swelled to 3 times its size, and with it, it brought a massive bounty of fish, which was great. So for 3 months, you had this massive bounty of food. People moved down. It was all great. But for the other 9 months of the year, it was dry. And what they did was they actually mastered this water. So they started to bring in a river, which they diverted about 50 miles. They then created funnels and canals over 620 miles squared that they could move water around, with reservoirs that held over 600 million cubic meters of water. Now, I wanted to put that in gallons. But as soon as I put it in the calculator, it started giving me exponential numbers. It is a silly amount of water. And what happened with these guys is as they used this monsoon, they were able to get a population upwards of about 1 million people around the main area to be in that civilization, and they needed to feed them. So this water allowed them to make furrows, to start agriculture and everything. But unfortunately for them, climate change kicked in. Here you can see a map. This is one of the reservoirs over here. Angkor Wat is sitting right here, and there are a myriad of funnels moving around here. But as things dried up, their ability to create food dropped away, and the entire civilization fell apart because of that. So our power to move, to create agriculture is incredible, but we're at the whim of the earth. So let's talk about the next one, Matt.
Mapon. So it's this little not isolated, but it's this little kingdom that was in South Africa that was discovered in should I say, in the 30s, but quite it was kept hidden by the former government in South Africa until 1994, when the fall of the apartheid era came about. And that was because there was the fear that the apartheid government didn't want the people of South Africa to know that there was a civilization in South Africa before colonization occurred. So there's a bit of a conspiracy around that. But there's the kingdom of Mapon is in the very far northern parts of South Africa, where South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe meet in these three rivers. And Mapon means the hill of the jackal. And they were this sort of small tribal area that grew and grew and grew into a small little kingdom. And you can see there the rounds, the foothill of that flat top mountain. The bottom, some of the bottom architecture has been carbon dated to about 1,100 years AD, so about 1,000 odd years ago, 900 odd years ago. And the fall of the civilization was at about 1400 AD, so about 650 odd years ago. And this was, so the bottom tribal areas would have been your sort of working class, your people moving around, and then your kings and queens and royalty would have been at the top. But what made these guys so interesting was their trade routes. They were one of the first southern let's call it sub-equatorial tribal kingdoms to have documented trades with China, with India, and with other kingdoms around the world. And this was shown in their creations, these masterpieces in gold that they were making. Their most notable is the one of the rhinoceros. So being near and dear to both of our hearts here in South Africa, the rhino, an emblem of power and strength. And they would have made these creations. And there was something like 17 or 1800 artifacts that were found in this little kingdom, which was just abandoned one day. And there are a lot of theories revolved or circling around how why they abandoned this area. But the one most notable one, and it goes back to what Richard was just saying with the last kingdom in Southeast Asia, was that of climate change. So this little kingdom of Mapon grew to the point where, because of the environment that they were in, the agriculture was not a long-term sustainable method of getting food. So they were kind of a hybrid of, they had some farming, they had some domestication, but then they were still hunter-gatherers. And then it got too hot and too dry in this area, and then they just weren't able to sustain their population as it had grown to that point. So they dissipated. They just disappeared. And there are other tribal kingdoms like this in southern Zimbabwe. and they go all the way into South Africa and stretch up into southwestern Mozambique. But very similar to a lot of other African tribes, this one was just one that was able to reach a point of almost becoming a kingdom and then collapsed with the onset of difficult environmental circumstances.
And one of our trips actually touches on this area. We go right past, we actually get to the point of this. So they're right on the border of Mashatu, and it's a fascinating place. We used to drive past it all the time, really beautiful. And to consider that you're in an area that this ancient civilization, this ancient kingdom used to move around is quite weird, because you don't hear a lot about ancient African civilizations. You hear about nomadic tribes doing their things. But one that we have heard a lot about are the Aztecs. And the Aztecs they flourished in sort of from the 14th to the 16th century, and at their height, there were about 11 million people under the rule of the Aztecs. They covered most of northern Mesoamerica, and their military was able to dominate around 500 smaller tribes and communities which fell under the Aztec kingdom. So it was a huge part of this area. And again, they did this through agriculture was the major part of it, but then trade and tribute formed the other basis of this empire. Growing food was of major importance because you needed to feed all these people. 11 million people is a lot of people to be feeding. So they had to work out ways to do this. So they grew corn, beans, and squash at the same time. And these three plants all assist one another. So corn requires nitrogen, which is created by the beans. The bean plants need support, which they get from the corn plants. So they use the stalk of the corn plants. And the squash, the leaves of the squash provided shade, which kept soils full of water and kept the weeds out. They also grew tomatoes, avocados, chili peppers, peanuts, limes, onions, amaranth, sweet potato. So you can see how this is quite incredible. But where it gets really amazing is they did this on these Chinampas. Chinampa is basically a floating island. You can see the people building this island. So they did it, they had this massive lake in front of the main area, the capital city, I'd call it, of the Aztec Empire. And what they would do is they raised them from the bottom of the lake. They built them up from sedimentation from the lake bottom, created large reed mats, which they then floated in the shallows and anchored them on the sides with poles. You can see the poles in the side here, and then planted fast-growing willow trees on the side, which would then anchor them into the soil and creating channels down the side. They would then use the soil that was on top, rotting vegetation they would put in there, so they already knew about composting and keeping that going, and getting soils or dust from other places. These crops, because of the hydroponics of it, so this was the first form of hydroponics, growing in water, that we had on the planet, and it could support 7 crops a year versus on land doing 1 crop. So this incredible amount of food that was coming out, and very powerful food. They also used terracing, which was a very good way of utilizing things, and they also farmed, or with the terracing, they actually used furrows, much like we were looking at the Egyptians. They used these furrows to move water around to where they needed. So they were very industrious in their way. You can even see the flying stairs or the floating stairs that were along here. They also farmed a fungus off the lake shore that was in between in these channels, which we today call spirulina. Now, they were very successful at building these things, and they didn't die because of a change in environmental situation. Their civilization came to an end because Europeans started moving around, and this movement really started things. So we jump into our environmental manipulation and our colonization and how we change the world moving forward.
So as Europe essentially got too small and insular to be able to sustain the number of people that were within it, and as the ambition of a lot of the European empires and kingdoms grew, so they started to spread and settle around the world. And as Richard just spoke about, with they moved in, took an idea, took over an area, changed it to their ways, and then moved on. They went to the Aztecs and basically took potatoes home with them. And that was all made possible by that industrialization. So they had ships. They moved in larger numbers instead of just moving with a boat. And they, before then, but their ability, and this would have moved through with the different tribes coming from Europe, coming from Africa, but our ability to change our environment. So early days of smelting bronze, moving into early days of smelting iron, and our ability to then mold it and shape it to how we wanted to use it. Then growing levels of industrialization. A lot of Europe was forested way back when. A lot of those forests were cut down, harvested to utilize for ships and for fuel sources to enable them to then smelt this iron and create these things out of it. And yeah, that ability enabled Europe to then slowly start to move across these vast tracts of ocean to go to the other places around the world. And through cultivation, they were able to take supplies with them for the however many months or years they would have been at sea.
The fascinating thing, and in the book *Sapiens* he brings it up, is the Europeans were not more advanced than the counterparts in Asia, say India and China. They just had a different outlook on what they wanted to do. And Europeans wanted to go out and explore and command other places where the other civilizations at their same power wanted to make sure that their people were all sorted and remained under that control. So it was this movement backwards and forwards. And I think in the greater scheme of things, the Industrial Revolution and colonization was a great driver of where it is the factor that has changed the world to what it is today. And I think, Matt, if you want to read that paragraph again, because I think it is such a powerful way of ending all of this before we start taking some questions.
Yeah, so the agricultural revolution certainly enlarged the sum total of food at the disposal of humankind. But the extra food did not translate into a better diet or more leisure. Rather, it translated into population explosions and pampered elites. The average farmer worked harder than the average forager and got a worse diet in return. The agricultural revolution was history's biggest fraud. Who was responsible? Neither kings, nor priests, nor merchants. The culprits were a handful of plant species, including wheat, rice, and potatoes. These plants domesticated Homo sapiens rather than the vice versa. And as Richard said, it's almost as if these plants were trying to, they use us to then proliferate the earth, because through us using them, we have proliferated the earth and thereby allowed them to move to all four corners of the globe. And yeah, I think that's a great point to open up some questions for anything or anyone about what we've just spoken about.
Thank you, guys. That was fascinating. Before we start the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone watching, if you have a question for Rich or Matt, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question. Near Mashatu, what remnants of the Mapon Guberway civilization are still visible?
So on that, I was actually there almost this time last year with my wife. We went camping there for a couple of days, and that almost Table Mountain, almost Uluru looking rock very similar to the one in the Australian outback, that sort of flat top mountain. There are 2 or 3 sort of staircases, very steep staircases on opposite sides, and you can go up there and you can still see ruins of settlements. But the majority of the artifacts, so that rhino, all of the gold, through fear of theft and burglary, they've been moved to the university in Pretoria. So you can still go there and walk through the museum and see replicas of what was there, but all of the valuable artifacts have been taken and for safekeeping at the University of Pretoria. But a lot of the settlements are still there, and the visitor centre is actually themed very much like it. It won a global architectural award when it was opened about 10 or 15 years ago, and it looks very similar to those old stone architectured buildings.
The other thing that's fascinating about this civilization is they also had buried remains, almost mummified remains. They were all adorned with different things. I think there were 12 skeletons found, if I'm not mistaken, Matt.
Yeah.
And you know, you're getting to this real, you know, something like Egypt, where you have these bodies, you have all this adornment, this gold, the ivory that was going through it. And I remember one of the trips that we went out on, I actually had 2 guests that were very into heritage sites and archaeology, and we walked around and we were just picking up arrowheads and clay pots and all of these old architectural things, just walking around on Mashatu, which is still a couple of miles away from where Mapon Guberway is. So it's a really fascinating place to visit just in general.
All right. And there was a question about the map of the potatoes. If you could bring that up again. Did it show that there were potatoes in Polynesia before the time of Columbus?
Yes, so those would have just been seafaring islanders that would have moved across, but that didn't really go much further out of Polynesia. And so the greater expansion of the potato came after Columbus.
Yeah,
okay.
The Polynesians were incredible seafarers. I think there's still traditions going on today that they have to be able to navigate. They get given a certain amount of food and water, and they get taught. And by looking at the sea, the ocean moving at their feet at a point, they can tell how far they are from the next island. So there is this incredible knowledge of seafaring. And if you consider our talk last week of how we already had pre-humans moving, or a different hominid species moving across those areas, they had this knowledge and ability to move around much better than what Europeans did at that stage.
In the last set of photos you had when you ended the presentation, what does the lower right photo signify?
That's iron smelting in Africa. There was a lot of iron smelting through the Iron Age all the way down through Africa. We still have sites in Kruger National Park where you can have these ore sites, and that's a big chimney where they would have stacked wood and coal to be able to get temperatures hot enough to smelt iron.
And interestingly, they would have used the clay from termite mounds to create this clay oven.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, on the map you had when you were talking about sunflowers and strawberries, did you say that those originated in North America?
Yep.
So the sunflower originated in North America, but then the strawberry, and also interestingly enough, the cranberries, a lot of your water-loving berries would have been found in the Northeast, and yeah.
And strawberries also occurred, you can see down here, down along Chile side of things.
And those likely would have been linked to a migratory route of birds that would have moved up and down from North America down the Andean spine there down into South America.
Mm-hmm. And the last question we'll take today is maybe a tough one. Can you forecast where civilization goes from here in the next 1,000 years?
Oh, that is, I think we can both have a stab at this one, Matt. But yeah, I think, you know, where the fascinating part of life is right now is if we go back 1,000 years and we look at how civilizations worked, there were very few unknowns in terms of what skills we required to move forward with our lives. We knew what to teach our kids in order for them to survive. The unknowns were when there was going to be a famine, who was going to be the next king, pharaoh, whatever. Those were the unknowns. Today, we are stuck with the position that in 30 years' time, we will not know, we do not know the skills that I need to teach my children in order to survive, because life is moving so fast, environment is changing so fast, and we have to find ways, because we've hit the AI, the artificial intelligence revolution right now, and we've got to find ways through this to be able to have those skills that we don't know what jobs are going to be there. Accountants will not exist, insurance brokers will not exist, because artificial intelligence will take it over. So I think the only answer I have is if we don't start caring for what we have, and we haven't been for thousands of years, as we've already seen, we are going to be stuck with the position that the earth will be great in 1,000 years. We just might not be here with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And to go back to what you were saying about how 1,000 years ago, all of those were the sort of mitigating factors of our lives and what were affecting us. But also 1,000 years ago, the people in South Africa had no idea what the people in South America were doing, had no idea what. So you have all of these isolated and very insular societies and kingdoms, whereas now we are part of a single global community. And for the first time in the history of the world, we have the ability, whether we're going to do it or not, to act as a single front, rather than fighting off one another, or this person's doing that, and let's all tug at a side of a rag. We can enforce these changes that we need to as a global community. And it goes back to a webinar that Richard and I were a part of last week with how sustainable tourism can help the world. And there was a subject that we touched on there with the need to rewild the wild places. And it's almost a reverse domestication. So what we've just spoken about here, what we need to do to ensure that we see what life is like in 1,000 years' time is try and wind back the clock on what we have already done. Now, that's not possible, but what we can do is we can take the remaining intact environments and what we have and start to grow on those and allow those to then get bigger and bigger. Because yeah, I'll finish with the same sort of line that Richard did, is that the earth is going to be here in 1,000 years, whether we are part of it. That's our next move, and our next move will determine that.
Great. That's a good place to end today, I think. So I will turn it back over to both of you for closing comments, and we'll start with Richard.
Again, thanks for everyone listening in. I think the journey of this, just the Sapiens journey, has been an amazing one for me, and I thank you all for listening to it, because I hope you're learning as much as I am about where we're going, where we've come from, and hopefully better direct how we move forward in all of this. So thanks, NatHab, thank you, WWF, and thank you to all of you for listening in every day, and thanks, of course, to Matt for being part of this whole thing with me and being my co-pilot.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And yeah, thanks once again to the WWF and NatHad for hosting us for these wonderful webinars, and thanks Kendall for having us tonight, and to Richard for co-hosting with me and again sharing this journey. And our next one takes us the next step into the third and final chapter of our Sapiens discussion, where we will actually spend a lot more time almost discussing what we have just touched on, what we've just ended on, and what we can do to ensure our survival as a species, the environmental impact, and the conservation initiatives that are ongoing, and the rewilding that is necessary and that is continuing, and hopefully will continue long after we are gone. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yeah, we can hear from you on that part 3 next week. So everyone watching, if you're interested in joining us, you can look out for the registration this weekend. So thank you, gentlemen, once again. This was absolutely fascinating. And thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Good night, everyone.